It looked like a harmless portrait of two young girls, but the ribbons around their wrists hinted at something troubling. Afternoon light slipped through the dusty windows in the attic of Amanda's late grandmother's house in Boston, stretching shadows across years of store belongings. Cardboard boxes lined the walls like small time capsules. Amanda had put off sorting through them for 3 months after her grandmother Dorothy passed at 94. Today, she finally gathered the courage. Dorothy had been a nurse, quiet but deeply caring. She almost never talked about the early years of her work. Whenever Amanda asked, Dorothy gave a soft smile and changed the subject, saying, "Some stories aren't mine to share." Amanda opened an old leather trunk tucked under a stack of quilts. Inside were worn sepia photos. Many showed groups of nurses in clean white uniforms standing in front of a large brick building. The place looked strict and plain, with bars on the upper windows. The sight made Amanda's stomach tighten. As she sorted the photos, one slipped out an old journal and landed on the floor. She picked it up, her reporter instincts kicking in. It showed two girls around 12 or 13, sitting stiffly in wooden chairs. They wore matching dark dresses buttoned to the neck. Their faces were blank, not sad, just strangely empty for children. Amanda's eyes caught on the white lace ribbons tied around each girl's wrists. They looked delicate, almost decorative, but something about them felt off. She turned the photo over. Written in faint ink were the words, Millbrook Institute for Wayward Girls, Massachusetts, 1878. May God forgive us. The message sent a cold feeling through her chest. Forgive us, not bless them. She held the picture up to the window. The ribbon seemed tight, too tight, and the skin underneath looked darker than it should. Her grandmother had kept this photo for a reason. Whatever that reason was, someone had tried hard to bury it. Amanda opened her laptop. She needed answers. The next morning she worked at the Boston Public Library, surrounded by old records. She learned the Millbrook Institute for Wayward Girls operated from 1868 to 1923 before shutting down suddenly. There were very few official documents. The term wayward girls bothered her. Back then it could refer to almost any girl who didn't follow expected behavior, spoke up, wanted more education, or was simply difficult for her family. A 1923 Boston Daily Globe article mentioned the Institute's closure, but gave no real explanation. Only vague comments about issues with management and concerns from former staff. Amanda saved the article and kept digging. At the state archives, she found the Institute's founding papers. The stated purpose was to offer moral correction and domestic training for girls judged to have troubled disposition or uncertain character. The wording didn't hide much. By the afternoon, she had created a timeline. She looked again at the photograph, studying it under her desk lamp. The girl's eyes stayed with her. That empty, distant look felt like a warning. She scanned the photo at high resolution and enhanced it on her computer. Close up, the truth appeared. The ribbons weren't decoration. They covered marks. Around the edges were clear patterns on both girls' wrists. The kind that suggested restraints had recently been removed. A faint bruise peeked out beneath one girl's lace ribbon. Her heart raced. This wasn't a simple portrait. It was evidence. Someone had dressed the girls, hidden their injuries with pretty ribbons, and taken a photo meant to show they were being cared for. It created an image of kindness that didn't match what really happened. Amanda needed their names. She needed to know their story. The next day, she visited the Massachusetts Historical Society. She arrived early, carrying her press badge and a photo in a protective sleeve. A librarian named Patricia looked at the picture and said Amanda wasn't the first person to ask about Millbrook. Patricia led her to a temperature control room where fragile documents were kept. She explained that most official records were said to have been lost in a fire in 1924, but a few personal letters and items had survived. Inside one box, Amanda found old letters written in fading ink. One, dated March 1878, was from a mother writing to the Institute's director. It began, "Dear Superintendent Clark, I write once more to ask about my daughter Catherine's condition." It had been 8 months since Catherine was sent to the Institute, and her mother wrote that she had received only one letter from her. Even that letter didn't look like Catherine's usual handwriting. The photo the Institute sent back showed her looking very different. The mother begged for reassurance that her daughter was safe and being guided with care. Clipped to the letter was the reply. It was short and firm. It stated that Catherine was getting the needed correction, that her progress was steady, and that more letters from home were unnecessary and would interfere with her improvement. Amanda clenched her jaw as she photographed the exchange and kept going. Another letter surfaced, this time from a father asking for his daughter Mary to be released immediately. He wrote that he had sent her there for guidance, not to see her change beyond recognition. He described how, during his last visit, she barely spoke and had unexplained marks on her arms. There was no reply attached to his letter. Patricia, the librarian, watched Amanda quietly. She said there were long-standing rumors passed through families. Stories about girls who left the Institute deeply affected, and some who never left at all. Amanda asked if she knew what truly happened to them. Patricia explained that the official cause of death for several girls had been listed as illnesses common at the time, like tuberculosis or influenza. But she also mentioned quiet talk about other reasons, including harsh punishment or lack of proper care. She said a former nurse had given a statement near the end of her life in 1967, claiming she had seen serious mistreatment. By then, most records were gone, and few people remained who could support her story. Amanda remembered her grandmother started nursing in 1948. She asked if the nurse's name survived. Patricia nodded and said it was Margaret Chin, who worked at the Institute from 1919 until it closed. Amanda sat in her car afterward, thinking hard. The name meant nothing to her, but her grandmother had kept that old photograph for decades. There had to be a link. She went back to Dorothy's attic with new determination. Inside the leather trunk, she found more of Dorothy's belongings. Her nursing school diploma from 1947, employment documents, and a small wooden box she hadn't noticed before. Inside were more photos. These were casual pictures, not stage portraits. One photo showed Dorothy as a young woman standing with an older Asian woman in a garden. On the back, in Dorothy's handwriting, it read, "Margaret and me, 1968. She finally told me everything." Amanda's breath caught. Her grandmother had known Margaret personally. At the bottom of the box was a cassette tape in a plastic case labeled only, "Margaret, October 1967. With shaking hands, Amanda searched until she found Dorothy's old tape player. She slid in the tape and pressed play. A crackle sounded, followed by an older woman's voice, accented but steady. She introduced herself as Margaret Chun, age 79. She explained that she had worked at the Millbrook Institute from 1919 to 1923. She said she was recording her story because she could no longer hold it alone, and because the girls who lived there deserved to have their experiences remembered. She paused, and Amanda heard a shaky breath. Margaret said the things she witnessed still weighed heavily on her. She admitted she had been young and scared and kept silent at the time, something she regretted every day. Now, nearing the end of her life, she wanted someone to know the truth. Amanda listened without moving as the tape continued. Margaret described her early days at the Institute. Locked rooms, sounds in the night, crying, pleading, and sometimes long stretches of silence that felt even worse. She spoke about the photographs. She explained that before pictures were sent to families, the girls were washed, dressed, and made presentable. Ribbons were tied to cover any marks. They were instructed to sit still or smile, while bruises stayed hidden under lace. Margaret said those photos were not proof of care, only reminders of responsibility long unspoken. The tape lasted about 40 minutes. Margaret spoke in detail about strict practices that were framed as training but caused harm. She described restraints used to control behavior, food taken away as discipline, and girls tied to their beds at night so they could not run away. When the recording ended, Amanda sat in the dim attic with tears on her cheeks. Her grandmother had known the truth. She had carried Margaret's words for years, unable to share them openly but refusing to let them fade. Now it was Amanda's turn to carry the responsibility forward. For the next 3 days, Amanda worked nonstop. She searched through archives, wrote notes, and followed every lead. Driven by the voices on the tape and the faces in the photo, she pieced together the history of the Millbrook Institute. She learned the institute was led by Superintendent Howard Clark from its opening in 1868 until 1920, when his son Jonathan took over for the final years. The Clark family had been well known in Massachusetts, respected and influential. Howard Clark had been praised in his time as someone devoted to helping families through firm guidance and traditional values. Many old newspaper articles portrayed the Institute as a helpful place for parents who felt overwhelmed. But Amanda understood the language of those years. Firm guidance often meant physical punishment. Strict discipline often meant isolation. Moral correction meant forcing children into compliance. In a digital archive, she found Howard Clark's published essays with titles focused on control and discipline. His writings described girls as problems to be managed through firmness and distance. One line stayed with her. The rebellious girl must learn that resistance brings only suffering. He wrote that once a girl realized that cooperation was the only way to ease her situation, her reform could begin. He claimed that sending families photographs of the girls in improved condition showed that the Institute's methods worked. Amanda felt a chill. Margaret Chen's testimony had been correct. The photographs were part of the system, carefully staged to hide the truth from parents and officials. Next, Amanda looked through property records and found the old layout of the Institute. There had been a main building with classrooms and offices, a dormitory wing, and a separate building simply labeled Correction Facility. That smaller structure had been torn down in 1924, just a year after the Institute closed. She also discovered that several former residents had died while at Millbrook. Causes listed on the records included tuberculosis, influenza, pneumonia, and in 3 cases, something called complications from melancholia. Every death certificate had been signed by the same doctor, Robert Ashford, who was related to Howard Clark through marriage. The pattern was becoming hard to ignore. Millbrook had been controlled by a tight circle of connected individuals. Families trusted the Institute's reputation, and the staged photographs helped maintain that trust. Meanwhile, the girls inside had little protection. Amanda returned to the photograph of the 2 girls. She still didn't know who they were, but she was determined to name them. Somewhere in the scattered archives, the truth existed. A breakthrough arrived unexpectedly. She had posted a message on a genealogy forum asking if anyone had relatives who had spent time at Millbrook. 2 days later, she received a reply from a woman named Helen Barrett in Vermont. Helen wrote that her great-great-aunt had been sent there in 1877 and was never the same afterward. She said she owned some of her aunt's belongings, including a hidden diary, and offered to let Amanda review it. Amanda drove to Vermont the next morning. Helen, a retired teacher in her 70s, welcomed her into a farmhouse full of family keepsakes. She brought out a wooden chest that held her ancestors' personal items. Her name was Elizabeth Hayes, Helen explained. She was sent to Millbrook at 13 because her father didn't like that she was reading medical books. He didn't think that kind of interest was proper for a girl. The diary was small and delicate, filled with tiny handwriting. Every inch of each page was used. The entries were painful to read. January 1878. They tied Sarah and me to our beds again last night. My wrists hurt. Superintendent Clark says resisting is wrong. That good girls must be quiet and still. But Sarah keeps crying. I'm afraid for her. Amanda felt her hands tremble. She asked whether Helen knew who Sarah was. Helen said the diary never mentioned a last name, only that the 2 girls seemed close. Amanda photographed the entire diary, with permission. More names appeared in the pages as she read. Catherine, Mary, Rebecca, Anne. Elizabeth had documented what happened to each girl, from punishment and isolation to sudden disappearances that were later explained as deaths from illness. One entry from March 1878 made Amanda stop. Today they took our photograph. They took off the restraints and tied pretty ribbons over the marks. They told us to sit still, that the picture would be sent to our families, so they would think we were cared for. Sarah and I sat side by side. I tried to make my face blank, so they couldn't see my anger. The ribbon on my wrist is white lace, hiding the truth of this place. Amanda asked if Helen had any photos of Elizabeth. Helen brought out a framed picture of a young woman in her 20s. Her expression was guarded, but Amanda recognized the same emptiness. she had seen in the portrait of the two girls. This was taken about 5 years after she left Millbrook, Helen said softly. She never married, never had children. She lived with her sister and passed away at 32. The family said it was pneumonia, but what? Amanda asked gently. My grandmother told me that Elizabeth had stopped eating, stopped talking. She slowly faded away. It was as if part of her never left that place. Amanda felt her eyes grow warm. She thought again of the two girls in the photograph, their expressions carefully arranged while ribbons covered their pain. She was now sure that one of them was Elizabeth Hayes. She just had to identify the second girl. She returned to Boston with Elizabeth's diary and a stronger sense of purpose. She contacted the Massachusetts State Archives and requested access to any remaining Millbrook documents. With her press credentials, she was granted permission to review a newly uncovered set of boxes found during a renovation. They had been sealed in a basement for nearly 100 years. In the quiet reading room, Amanda opened the first box. Inside were intake forms written neatly in old-fashioned handwriting. Each form listed a girl's name, age, day of admission, and the reason she'd been sent there. The reasons ranged from sad to shocking, to willful, reading inappropriate material, refusing arranged marriage, improper interest in education, challenging religious authority. Some girls were only 11. Amanda sorted through the files, focusing on entries from 1877 and 1878. There it was. Elizabeth Hayes, admitted September 1877, page 13. The intake form for Elizabeth Hayes listed her reason for placement as unwilling interest in academic subjects and not obeying her father's wishes. Amanda kept flipping through the pages. 2 entries later, she found what she had been hoping for. Sarah Miller, admitted October 1877, age 12. Reason: emotional outbursts and refusing her mother's guidance. Sarah, the same girl Elizabeth mentioned again and again in her diary. Amanda's hands shook as she photographed both forms. She finally had names for the girls in the photo, but she needed to know what happened to Sarah. In the next box were medical notes. The handwriting belonged to Dr. Ashford. His entries were short and formal, often saying the same things. Correction given, behavior improving, discipline applied. But one note made Amanda stop. Sarah Miller, age 13. Continued resistance to rules. Increased restraint required. Showing signs of exhaustion. Recommend extended isolation. The date was April 1878, about a month after the photograph had been taken. Deeper in the records, Amanda found a death certificate. Sarah Miller had passed away on June 15, 1878. The official cause was listed as brain fever brought on by melancholic condition. She was only 13. Amanda leaned back, feeling sick. Brain fever was a common label used at the time to explain deaths caused by neglect, poor care, or severe emotional stress. Sarah had died just 2 months after sitting for the photograph, the same one where her wrists were covered by lace ribbons. But there was more. Amanda found letters from Sarah's mother, each one more desperate than the last. She demanded answers, asked to see her daughter, and questioned the explanation she had been given. Her final letter, dated July 1878, read, I am told my daughter has died. I want her returned home for burial and a clear explanation of what happened. The reply, written by Superintendent Clark, was brief. He said Sarah had been buried on the Institute's grounds with her father's permission and that the matter was closed. Her father had overridden her mother's wishes. Amanda's chest tightened. She had uncovered what truly happened. Now she needed to bring it into the light. The old Millbrook property had been sold and developed long ago. The main building was torn down in 1952, and the land was now filled with offices and homes. But one of the letters mentioned a cemetery on the far eastern side of the grounds, past what had once been an apple orchard. Amanda reached out to the current property owners and received permission to explore the area. The eastern side was now an overgrown patch of land between 2 buildings, surrounded by a chain-link fence. She hired a local historian named Thomas, who specialized in forgotten burial sites. Using old maps and careful searching, they pushed through thick brush and tangled vines. After an hour, Thomas crouched and pointed to the ground. "Here," he said quietly. What had once been a cemetery was now barely visible. Most of the stones were gone, likely removed over the years. But a few small markers remained, hidden under layers of soil and fallen leaves. Thomas brushed off one stone until faint letters appeared. SM, 1865 to 1878. May she find peace. Sarah Miller. No full name, no family message, only initials and dates. Amanda knelt beside the stone, eyes stinging with tears. A girl of 13, sent away for what her family called a troubling temperament, restrained and isolated, and now resting in a nearly forgotten grave. Thomas uncovered 3 more small stones. 2 showed only initials and dates. 1 had no markings at all. "There are probably many more," Thomas said softly. "Records suggest at least a dozen girls passed away during the Institute's years. Most of their graves are likely here." Amanda looked around at the quiet patch of land, surrounded by modern buildings where people lived and worked, unaware of what had once happened on this ground. She thought of Elizabeth, who survived but lived with lasting pain. She thought of the photograph and the girl's empty expressions. She lifted her phone and took photos of the cemetery, documenting everything she could. Thomas asked gently, "What are you going to do with this?" Amanda set her jaw. "I'm going to make sure Sarah Miller and the other girls aren't forgotten. I'm going to tell the story that was hidden for so long. They deserve better, and the least I can do is share the truth." She had names. She had records. She had Margaret Chen's testimony and Elizabeth Hayes' diary. It was time to write. Amanda spent 2 weeks crafting the article, pulling together every piece of evidence. She titled it, "The Ribbon and the Lie: How a Massachusetts Institution Hid Mistreatment of Girls Behind a Reputation for Respectability." The article began with a photograph of the 2 young girls, their faces blank, white ribbons tied around their wrists. She described the moment she realized the truth behind those ribbons. Hidden marks, for stillness, and carefully arranged images meant to reassure families while concealing the suffering inside. She shared Elizabeth Hayes' experience using excerpts from the diary. With Helen Barrett's permission, she wrote about Sarah Miller, including the records of her death and the forgotten grave where she had been laid to rest. She included Margaret Chen's recorded testimony, her grandmother Dorothy's efforts to protect it, and the long-running pattern of harm that had been allowed to continue because the people in charge were respected and well-connected. The article explained how the Clark family had used their influence to quiet concerns, how Dr. Ashford signed off on causes of death that should have been questioned, and how parents who raised objections were brushed aside. Amanda listed the other names she had uncovered: Catherine, Mary, Rebecca, and many girls whose so-called misbehavior was simply being curious, smart, outspoken, or unwanted. She described how the correction facility was torn down soon after the institute closed, how many records had been destroyed, and how silence had protected an image of respectability at the expense of vulnerable children. Amanda sent the finished piece to her editor at the Boston Globe's investigative unit. 2 days later, her phone rang. She shared Elizabeth Hayes' experience using excerpts from the diary. With Helen Barrett's permission, she wrote about Sarah Miller, including the records of her death and a forgotten grave where she had been laid to rest. She included Margaret Chen's recorded testimony, her grandmother Dorothy's efforts to protect it, and the long-running pattern of harm that had been allowed to continue because the people in charge were respected and well-connected. The article explained how the Clark family had used their influence to quiet concerns, how Dr. Ashford signed off on causes of death that should have been questioned, and how parents who raised objections were brushed aside. Amanda listed the other names she had uncovered: Catherine, Mary, Rebecca, and many girls whose so-called misbehavior was simply being curious, smart, outspoken, or unwanted. She described how the correction facility was torn down soon after the institute closed, how many records had been destroyed, and how silence had protected an image of respectability at the expense of vulnerable children. Amanda sent the finished piece to her editor at the Boston Globe's investigative unit. 2 days later, her phone rang. "Amanda, this is remarkable," her editor Mark said, "but you know this is going to upset people. The Clark family still has prominent descendants in the state." "I know," she answered. "I have every source documented. Photos, letters, testimony, official forms." The facts are solid. Then we're running it, Mark said. Front page, Sunday edition. Are you ready for the reaction? Amanda thought of Sarah Miller's small grave, of Elizabeth Hayes's quiet stare in that old photo, and of her grandmother keeping Margaret's tapes safe for decades. I'm ready, she said. The article came out on Sunday. By midday, Amanda's phone was buzzing nonstop. Reporters asked for interviews. Historians shared new information. Genealogists sent more names of girls who had once been sent to Millbrook. But the most touching messages came from families. People wrote about relatives who had been at the Institute and returned changed, or never returned at all. One woman wrote, "My great-grandmother was at Millbrook in 1881. She never talked about it, but she kept a small white ribbon in her Bible all her life. I didn't understand why until I read your article. Thank you for giving her silence meaning." Before long, the state attorney general's office announced it would review whether the unmarked graves needed official investigation. The Massachusetts Historical Commission designated the old Millbrook property as historically significant. A local group began raising funds for a memorial to honor the girls. Amanda stood in her grandmother's attic, holding the original photo of the two young girls. She had restored their names. She had uncovered the truth behind the ribbons. She had carried forward the work her grandmother and Margaretchen had protected for so many years. What had once looked like a simple portrait had finally revealed what lay beneath it, bringing long overdue attention to a history hidden in the shadows. 6 months later, Amanda stood in a cold November drizzle at the former Millbrook grounds. Nearly 200 people gathered around her, descendants of former residents, historians, child welfare advocates, reporters, and community members moved by the story. A granite memorial now marked the old cemetery, engraved with the names Amanda uncovered: Sarah Miller, Elizabeth Hayes, Catherine Walsh, Mary O'Brien, Rebecca Thompson, and others. Beneath them read, "And for those whose names we do not know, you are not forgotten." During the ceremony, Helen Barrett held Elizabeth's photo, saying she deserved to be remembered with care. Amanda spoke about the photo that once hid the girls' injuries and the truth revealed beneath those ribbons. Afterward, Ruth Clark approached, apologizing for her family's role and promising to release their records. The girls of Millbrook were no longer forgotten.